The morning Jane Chandler sent out 17 letters was the same morning she burned her husband's old boots in the yard, because she had decided, with quiet and absolute certainty, that sentiment would not feed her son through the coming winter. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in Collin County, Texas, where the red earth had gone to dust from a dry summer, and the wind came down from the north carrying the first sharp bite of what would be a punishing cold season. The land around the Chandler homestead was not spectacular land. It was not the kind of country that made a man want to write poetry. It was flat in places and gently rolling in others, broken by a scatter of post oaks and the long silver thread of a creek that ran behind the property and which had, by October, shrunk to something barely worth calling a creek at all. But it was her land, 40 acres of it, deeded and paid for by a man named Robert Chandler who had worked himself into an early grave on its behalf. Robert had been dead for 8 months. Pneumonia, the doctor from McKinney had said, which was the kind of word that felt too small for the thing that had happened. He had been 34 years old and healthy enough in the fall, and then the winter came and he got wet one night chasing a calf through the rain, and 3 weeks after that he was gone. He had left behind a son named Thomas who was 6 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He had left behind a house that needed a new roof on the eastern side. He had left behind 12 head of cattle, a plow horse named Biscuit, and a wife who had not once in the 8 months since, allowed herself the luxury of not knowing exactly what needed to be done next. Jane was 31 years old. She had come to Texas from Missouri at 19 when she married Robert, and she had learned the land the way a person learns a difficult language, with great patience and not a small amount of frustration, until it became, eventually, the only language she thought in. She knew the cattle. She knew the planting cycles. She knew how to read the sky and what it meant when the clouds stacked up tall and flat-bottomed to the southwest. She was not helpless, and she had never been helpless, and the one thing she had refused to do in all the months since Robert died was perform helplessness for the benefit of people who might otherwise have been willing to take advantage of it. Which was why the letters were the way they were. She had sat at the kitchen table 3 evenings in a row, with Thomas already asleep in the back room and the lamp burning low, and written the same letter 17 different times in her clean, practical hand. She had found the names in the county tax records, which she had ridden into McKinney to read at the courthouse, sitting very straight in the wooden chair while the county clerk watched her with undisguised curiosity. Every rancher in Collin County who ran more than 50 head of cattle, 17 of them. She knew some of their names from church and from market days. Others she had never met. It did not matter either way. The letter was not begging. She had been very careful about that. It was a proposition, stated plainly and without apology. It read in full, "My name is Jane Chandler. I am the widow of Robert Chandler, who held 40 acres on the South Fork Road 7 miles out of McKinney. I have 12 head of longhorn cattle and 1 plow horse and enough grain to see through the first month of winter if the weather holds reasonable. I am writing to every rancher in this county to ask if there is a man among them who will deal fairly with me. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for fair trade. I can offer labor, which I am not too proud for. I can offer the use of my land for grazing right-of-way in exchange for supplies, or for the addition of cattle to my herd on reasonable profit-split terms. I know this land and I know cattle, and I will work as hard as any man you have in your employ. If you are interested in a fair arrangement with a neighbor who will not cheat you or disappoint you, I ask that you write back. If you are not, I ask that you do me the courtesy of not writing back at all rather than writing back with something less than fair. Respectfully, Jane Chandler." She had sealed each one herself, heated the wax herself, ridden to town herself to hand them to the postmaster, and come home to find that Thomas had attempted to fry an egg on the stove and had made a reasonable mess of it, which had made her laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember. That had been 3 weeks ago. The first response had come after 5 days. It was from a man named Holt Greer, who ran a large operation north of town, and who everyone in the county knew had money and fewer scruples than he had money. His letter had been 1 paragraph long, and had offered to purchase her land outright at a price that she recognized immediately as being roughly half of what it was worth, framed generously as rescuing her from a difficult situation. She had set that letter on the shelf above the fireplace and stared at it for one evening, and then used it to start the fire the following morning. 2 more responses came over the following week. One was from a man who proposed she lease her grazing rights for a fee so low it would not have covered Thomas's boots for the winter, much less anything else. The other was from a man she knew slightly from church who wrote very kindly and at great length to say that he was sorry for her circumstances and would pray for her, which she appreciated in the spirit it was meant, but which did not answer the question she had asked. The 14th day after she had sent the letters, and the 4th day after the last response she had received, Jane stood at the kitchen window in the morning and looked out at the yard and the flat land beyond it and the pale sky above that and thought, with the same steadiness she had applied to everything, about what she would do if no one answered fairly. She could sell a portion of the cattle now, before they lost any more condition, and use the money to buy provisions for winter. She could take in washing or sewing, though the nearest neighbors were 4 miles away. She could write to her sister in Missouri. She would not write to her sister in Missouri. It was on the 16th day that a letter arrived which was different from the others, and which she stood at the gate to read rather than carrying it inside, because something about the handwriting on the envelope made her want to open it immediately. The handwriting was plain and even, not particularly elegant, but deliberate. The kind of penmanship that suggested a man who did not write many letters but who took care with the ones he wrote. It said, "Mrs. Chandler, I received your letter and I have read it twice. I run the Vaughn operation out on the East Ridge Road, about 9 miles from your place. I have 260 head and enough range for considerably more. I want to be straightforward with you because your letter asked for straightforwardness, and I respect that. I think your proposition is sound. I think fair trade is what it is, and I have no interest in anything less than that. I would be willing to meet with you at your convenience to discuss what an arrangement might look like that genuinely benefits both parties. I should tell you that I know a little of Robert Chandler, though we never met properly, and I know he worked good land and kept it well. That tells me something about the kind of partnership I would be entering. I will say one more thing and then stop saying things, which is that I am a man who means what he says, and if I tell you I will do something fairly, then I will do it fairly. I don't know you yet, but I know the tone of your letter, and I think you are someone who needs to be dealt with honestly and not managed. Write back if you want to meet. If you don't, I will understand." Daniel Vaughn. Jane read the letter twice standing at the gate. Then she read it a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron and went inside and put water on for coffee and stood at the stove thinking about it. He had said he read it twice. He had said he thought she was someone who needed to be dealt with honestly and not managed. He had said fair trade is what it is. She wrote back that same afternoon. The meeting was set for the following Thursday, which gave Jane 4 days to think too carefully about it, and Thomas 4 days to ask her 17 times who the man was, and why he was coming and whether he was bringing horses. Because Thomas had recently become passionate about horses in the way that 6-year-old boys became passionate about things, which was to say completely and without reservation. She told Thomas that the man was a rancher and that he might be bringing a horse, which satisfied him temporarily, and that the meeting was about business, which satisfied him not at all. Thursday came in clean and cool, with a sky so blue it looked painted. Jane had been up since before light doing the chores that needed doing, and she had changed into her better dress, which was navy wool and which she told herself was only practical given the temperature, and she had her hair in a neat braid, rather than the loose knot she usually wore it in during the week. She told herself this too was practical. She did not examine that thought very closely. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, a steady canter coming up the South Fork Road, and she stepped out onto the porch with her coffee cup in her hand and watched Daniel Vaughn come up the drive. He was riding a gray roan, well-muscled and sure-footed, and he sat in the saddle the way a man sits when he has spent his whole life in one, which is to say as if the horse and the man were a single thing that happened to have 4 legs. He was, she guessed, somewhere near her own age, perhaps a year or 2 older, which she had not expected. She had formed some image in her mind of an older man, graying and weathered, and the man who swung down from the gray roan and looped the reins over her fence post was none of those things. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from work rather than nature, with brown hair that wanted cutting and a face that was tanned and a little angular and entirely honest-looking. He had a kind of steadiness to him that she noticed before she noticed anything else, the way certain men seemed rooted to the ground they stood on. He pulled off his hat when he reached the porch steps. "Mrs. Chandler," he said. His voice was low and even, matching his handwriting. "Mr. Vaughn," she said. "Thank you for making the ride. It's a good morning for it," he said, and looked out at the land around the house with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than assessment. "You've got good range here, creek-fed." "The South Fork," she said. "It's low this year, but it runs." He nodded, still looking at the land. "Mine's the same. Dry summer hit everyone in this county." She invited him inside for coffee, and he thanked her and sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his hands wrapped around the cup she gave him, and they talked. She had expected negotiation, the kind with long pauses and careful words placed like stones in a river. What she got instead was conversation, the real kind, where both people were actually paying attention to what the other one said. He asked her about the cattle, and she told him about the 12 head and their condition and the grazing situation heading into winter. He asked her about the land and whether she'd considered running any additional stock in the spring. She asked him about his operation, and he told her without hesitation about the Vaughn Ranch, about the 260 head, about the East Ridge Range and its water sources and the crew he kept, which was 4 men through the winter and 2 additional hired on in spring. He did not talk around the subject of Robert, but when it came up naturally, he did not look uncomfortable with it either. He said simply that he was sorry for her loss and that he meant it, and she believed him and moved on, which was all she needed. "What I'd propose," he said, after the coffee was half gone and the conversation had laid out all the groundwork, "is this. You let me graze 50 head on your South Range through the winter. In exchange, I bring you a supply of grain from my stores, and 2 of my hands help you with your fencing and your roof, which I can see from the yard needs attention." She had been watching him carefully, and she continued to watch him. "That's generous on the supplies and the labor," she said. "It's fair," he said simply. "Your South Range in winter is worth that and more to me. I've got cattle that'll eat down my own range if I don't spread them out. And come spring," he said, "if you want to talk about adding to your herd on a profit split arrangement, I'd be interested in that conversation. But that's a different conversation, and I didn't come here to crowd you with it." She appreciated that so much she made herself be careful not to show how much. "I'll agree to the winter arrangement," she said, "on one condition, which is that if either of us feels it's not going fair, we say so plainly instead of just letting it rot." He looked at her steadily across the table. "That's not a hard condition," he said. They shook hands on it, and his hand was warm and firm, and she let go of it at the appropriate time and stood to refill the coffee, and that was the beginning. Thomas came in from outside approximately 12 seconds later, as if he had been waiting behind the door, which, given that he was 6 years old, he probably had been. He looked at Daniel Vaughn with the frank and merciless evaluation of a child. "Did you bring a horse?" he asked. "Thomas," Jane said. "It's all right," Daniel said, and looked at Thomas with an expression that was neither condescending nor falsely hearty, but simply level and straightforward. I did bring a horse, a gray roan. She's tied at your fence post." Thomas turned and ran back outside at approximately the speed of everything he did. Daniel watched him go, and there was something in his expression that Jane could not quite read, but that was not unfriendly. "Good boy," he said. "He is," she said. "He's a very good boy." There was a small silence that was not uncomfortable. Daniel Vaughn finished his coffee and stood and put on his hat and said he would have the first supplies out by the end of the week and 2 of his men with lumber for the roof the following Monday. And she thanked him, and he walked out to where Thomas was standing at the fence looking at the roan with an expression of pure adoration. She watched from the porch as Daniel went to the fence and talked to her son. She could not hear what was said, but she saw Thomas look up at him with bright eyes and saw Daniel put one hand on the top of the fence post and say something that made Thomas laugh. Then Daniel swung up into the saddle and tipped his hat to her from across the yard, and she raised one hand in acknowledgement, and he rode back out the way he came, the gray roan's hooves raising small puffs of red dust from the dry road. She stood on the porch for a moment after he was out of sight. "He said I can come see the roan's foal when it's born," Thomas reported, running back to the porch with the energy of someone who had just received excellent news. "He said she's carrying and the foal should come in early spring, and he said I could come see it." "Did he?" Jane said. "He did," Thomas said firmly, as if she might doubt it. She did not doubt it. She was already learning that Daniel Vaughn said things he meant. The 2 men came on Monday, as he had said. A pair of quiet, competent ranch hands named Silas and Pete, who arrived with a wagon full of lumber and spent 2 days on her roof without needing to be directed, and who ate the lunches she made them with genuine gratitude and very little conversation. On Wednesday, the wagon came back with grain, enough grain to carry her through the winter with careful management, along with 2 cured hams and a small barrel of salt pork that she had not asked for, and which she stood looking at for a long moment before she carried it into the pantry. She wrote him a note. She wrote that the roof and the grain were received, and that she wanted to address the hams and the salt pork, which had not been part of the agreement. He wrote back. He said the hams and the salt pork were from his own stores, and that they had more than they could use before the spring salt delivery, and that if it made her more comfortable she could count them against the spring profit split conversation if they had it, but that he had sent them because it seemed right, and not because he expected anything. She wrote back. She said she would accept them in the spirit they were sent, and that she wanted him to know she was paying attention to the difference between a man who dealt fairly and a man who found ways to be owed something, and that she appreciated that he appeared to be the former. He wrote back one line. He said, "I appreciate that you said so." This exchange of letters, which began as pure business correspondence, became something she found herself looking forward to in a way she did not examine very carefully for the first month. And then, when she did examine it, examined only briefly before setting it aside to deal with at a later date. He came to check on the stock he had moved to her south range in November, and this time he stayed for supper. She had not planned supper. She had been making stew for herself and Thomas, and there was enough, and she asked before she thought about it, standing in the doorway with the spoon in her hand, while Thomas looked at Daniel with his full attention, and the November dusk came in cold through the open door. He stayed for supper, and they sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Thomas talked at great length about school, which he had started attending in McKinney 3 days a week, riding the first 2 miles with Jane and the last 2 with the Whitmore family who lived on the county road, and about his friends at school, and about a boy named Jacob who had apparently done something impressive involving a jar of frogs. Daniel listened to all of this with the same steady attention he brought to everything and asked questions that were specific rather than general, which Thomas responded to with the particular approval of a child who is being actually listened to rather than simply tolerated. Jane watched this and felt something shift in her, some internal thing she had been keeping very carefully in place, and she looked down at her stew and took a careful breath. After Thomas went to bed, She and Daniel sat at the table a while longer with the lamp burning between them, and they talked about things that were not strictly business. He told her about the Vaughn ranch, which had been his father's, and how his father had died 4 years ago and left it to him and his younger brother Sam, and how Sam had gone to New Mexico territory 2 years since to try his luck there, and how he had bought out Sam's share and now ran it alone. She asked if that was lonely, running it alone, and he looked at the lamp for a moment and said, yes, in the honest way of a man who was not trying to perform stoicism. She told him about Missouri and about coming to Texas and about the first years on the land, which had been hard in the way all first years were, and about Robert, not the grief of Robert but the life of him, the things he had been good at and the things he had not been, and the way the land had been theirs together, and how it had taken her some time after he was gone to understand that the land was simply hers now and that this was not wrong. He listened to all of it. When he finally stood to leave, the lamp had burned low and the kitchen had gone cold around the edges, and he put on his coat and his hat and she walked him to the door, and on the porch in the cold dark he said simply, "I'm glad you wrote those letters, Mrs. Chandler," she said. "I'm glad one person wrote back." He nodded once, and she could see his breath in the cold air, and then he was down the steps and across the yard and up on the roan, and she stood on the porch in the cold watching him go and feeling the particular warmth of a conversation that had been genuinely worthwhile. He began coming by on Sundays. It started practically enough, as things with Daniel Vaughn tended to start. He had stock on her range and it made sense to check it weekly, and Sunday was the day his crew had their half day and he did his own riding. But the first Sunday he rode up and she was on the porch with coffee, and she handed him a cup almost before she realized she had been expecting him, and neither of them remarked on this, and he stayed 2 hours, and then the next Sunday he stayed 3, and somewhere in there they stopped pretending it was purely about the stock. December settled in hard and cold. The land went brown and brittle, and the creek dropped further, and the nights bit down to temperatures that sent Jane to bank the fire before bed and still wake in the night to add wood. She was not afraid of winter, but she respected it, and with the grain Daniel had supplied and the cattle steady and the roof sealed, she found that this was the first winter in 4 years that she was not afraid of what the cold might take from her. Thomas, who was adaptable in the way of children who had grown up with a mother who was adaptable, had added Daniel Vaughn to his understanding of the world with the thoroughness of a boy who saw things plainly. He spoke about him at school, apparently, which Jane learned from Mrs. Whitmore, who stopped her on the county road one afternoon to say with great kindness and complete transparency that Thomas had told his classmates that his mother had a friend named Mr. Vaughn who had a gray roan and who knew everything about cattle. Jane had thanked her and ridden home with her cheeks warm, and it was not from the cold. On the second Sunday in December, Daniel arrived and the sky was already coming down gray and heavy, and by the time they had walked the South Range together and checked the stock it was snowing, soft and steady, the first real snow of the season. Thomas ran out into it with both arms wide and his face turned up, and Jane stood at the edge of the porch watching and laughing, and Daniel stood beside her and watched too, and she felt the warmth of him at her shoulder even through the cold air. "He's a remarkable boy," Daniel said quietly. "He is," she said. "He takes after his father in the good ways. And his mother in the rest of them, I'd expect," Daniel said. She looked at him sideways, and he was watching the snow with a small, genuine smile, and she looked back at Thomas and said nothing, because she did not have the right word for the thing she was feeling. He stayed for supper again that evening, because the snow was picking up and it made no sense to ride 9 miles in it, which was practical and also convenient. And after Thomas was in bed and the snow was coming down steadily outside the window, they sat by the fire, which was not the kitchen table but the small sitting room where she rarely sat because it felt too quiet alone, and they talked until the fire burned low, and then he built it back up without being asked and sat back down and they kept talking. She asked him why he had never married. She had not planned to ask that. It came out in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, the spring calving schedule or the conditions of the East Ridge Range. She could not exactly say, but it was out and she did not take it back. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire, his hands easy in his lap. "I was engaged once," he said. "About 5 years ago. Woman named Clara. She was from Dallas, came out to visit her uncle, and we met at a church social." A pause. "She decided after 8 months that she didn't want the ranch life. She was right to decide that. It wouldn't have been fair to either of us." "I'm sorry," Jane said. "I was for a while," he said honestly. "Now I think it was just the right ending to the wrong beginning." He looked at her then, directly. "What made you send those letters the way you did? The way you wrote them, I mean. Most women in your position would have been softer about it." She considered the question seriously. "Because I knew what I was offering was fair, and I didn't see any reason to pretend it was a favor I was asking for. Robert always said that if you lead with apology, you invite people to take advantage of you. He was right about that." "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was a very good man," she said. "Not a perfect one, but a genuinely good one." She felt Daniel looking at her with that steady attention of his, and she met his eyes, and there was a moment, clear and warm as a lamp turned up in a dark room, where they both understood something that neither of them had said. She felt the color in her face and looked back at the fire. "It's getting late," she said. "It is," he agreed. He did not leave, though, immediately. He stood and banked the fire for her, methodically and well, and pulled on his coat and hat, and she walked him to the door, and on the porch the snow had stopped and the world outside was white and still, and the stars were coming back between the breaking clouds. "I'll be back next Sunday," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her, and in the cold starlight she could see the expression on his face clearly, and it was the expression of a man who was choosing his words carefully, not because he was hiding something but because he valued precision. "Jane," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it like a struck match. "Daniel," she said, equally carefully. He smiled then, a real one, slow and genuine, and it changed his whole face in a way she had not seen before and which she found she very much wanted to see again. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She stood on the porch in the cold and watched him ride out across the white land, the roan's hooves leaving dark prints in the snow, and she stood there until she could no longer hear the hoofbeats. Then she went inside and put her back against the closed door and let herself feel, for a carefully counted 60 seconds, everything she had been storing up since that first afternoon when he had sat at her kitchen table and looked at her land with genuine interest, and said that fair trade is what it is. Then she went to bed, because there was stock to check at first light and Thomas to get ready for school and work that needed doing, and sentiment, as she had told herself on the morning she sent the letters, would not feed her son through the winter. But she smiled in the dark before she slept, and she let herself do that. Christmas came, which Jane had been prepared to make small and quiet. She had a little money from the sale of 2 cattle in November, enough for Thomas's gifts and for a decent meal, and she had been planning a private, steady celebration that would honor the holiday without pretending everything was easy. What she had not been planning for was Daniel Vaughn, who arrived 4 days before Christmas on the roan with a second horse trailing behind him, a small, steady paint mare, and who tied both horses at the fence and came to the porch and said, with a kind of careful formality that she recognized as the armor of a man proposing something he was not certain of the reception of, that he wondered if she and Thomas would like to come to the Christmas gathering at the Dobbins place this year. She knew the Dobbins. Most of the county did. They were a large family, 8 children and a pair of grandparents and various relations, who kept a big house 4 miles south, and who hosted a gathering every Christmas that was part church service, part social, and part potluck supper, and which was one of the few occasions in Collin County where everyone came regardless of whether they liked each other. "I haven't been to the Dobbins Christmas since Robert died," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought you might want to go this year." She looked at the paint mare. "Is that horse for me?" "Her name is Daisy," he said. She's sound and gentle, and she's not borrowed, she's mine to offer. Her and her foal in the spring if you want her." She looked at him. He looked back at her with that clear, honest expression. "That's more than fair," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but I'd like you to come to the Christmas gathering, and Biscuit is better suited to the plow than the ride, and Daisy wanted a good home." Thomas, who had appeared from nowhere in the way of 6-year-olds everywhere, was already at the fence looking at the paint mare with an expression of religious devotion. They went to the Dobbins' Christmas. It was a significant thing in the way that small public acts in small communities were significant, which was to say that everyone noticed and most people had opinions. Jane was aware of this in the precise way she was aware of most things, which was clearly and without distress. She was a widow. She was allowed to attend a Christmas gathering. She was allowed to arrive with a neighbor. She was allowed to stand in the warm, noisy Dobbins house with a cup of cider in her hand and talk to people she had not seen in months, while Thomas ran wild with the Dobbins children and Daniel stood at her shoulder with the natural ease of a man who felt he had a right to be there. Holt Greer was there. He saw her from across the room and came over with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who thought his presence was a gift, and he said something that was on its surface friendly, and in its undercurrent a suggestion that she must be glad to have some support given her situation. And she heard Daniel, very quietly, beside her say, "Mrs. Chandler's situation is well in hand, Holt." And Greer looked at Daniel and then at Jane and made a calculation and excused himself. And Jane looked at her cider and took a sip and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Later, when the children were fed and some of the older people had gone home, and the gathering had loosened into general warmth and noise, she found herself standing on the Dobbins porch in the cold with Daniel beside her, looking out at the dark and the stars, and listening to the singing coming through the windows, and it was very like the night at her own door except that this time neither of them moved to say good night. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "I want to ask if you would be willing to consider, not yet, but at some point, something more than a business arrangement." He said it with the deliberate precision she had come to expect from him, and it struck her, not for the first time, that this was a man who chose honesty over strategy even when strategy might have been easier. "I'm not saying I'm certain of anything. I'm saying I'd like the chance to be certain if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because the question deserved a real answer and not an impulsive one. "I've been thinking about this," she said, which was not the whole truth, which was that she had been thinking about this with some portion of her mind since November. "I don't need anyone to manage me or my land or my son. I need what I asked for in those letters. I need someone who will deal with me honestly." "I know that," he said. "If I was willing," she said carefully, "it would be because of what I know of you so far, which is that you are a man who does what he says. That matters more to me than most things." "That's a fair condition," he said. "It's the only condition," she said. He turned to look at her and she turned to look at him. And in the cold dark of the Dobbins porch, with the singing coming warm through the walls and the stars very bright overhead, she felt the full weight of the moment, which was considerable and which she bore without flinching. "Then I'd like very much to court you properly," he said, "if that suits." She felt the smile coming up in her before she could decide whether to show it, and she let it come. "It suits," she said. He smiled back, and it was the same smile she had seen on the night of the first snow, slow and genuine and changing his whole face, and she thought it was a very good smile and she was glad of it. January in Collin County was not kind. The temperature dropped hard after Christmas, and the cattle on both ranges needed extra feeding, and the creek froze in patches, and the roads turned to frozen ruts that punished anything with wheels. Jane managed her land with the same quiet competence she always had, but she found that managing it felt different this winter than it had the winter before. There was a lightness to it that she recognized, after some thought, as the absence of dread, which had been such a constant companion for the past 8 months that its absence felt like its own presence. Daniel came on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays too, riding the 9 miles in the cold without complaint, always with some practical purpose, checking the stock, bringing a piece of equipment she needed, working on the fence line on the east side of her property, which had been deteriorating since the previous spring. But the practical purposes were, they both understood, the frame around something else, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He was, she discovered, quietly funny in a way that was not obvious until you knew him well enough to notice the very small things he said that were deadpan and precise, and which made her laugh with a sudden spontaneity that surprised her every time. He was also genuinely curious about everything, about her thoughts on cattle management and on the county politics, and on the books she read in the evenings, and on what she thought about the railroad that everyone said was coming, but no one could say when. He asked her questions and listened to the answers, which she found more attractive than most things. She thought in an honest private moment in late January, in real danger of being quite thoroughly in love with this man, and she found that she did not want to be careful about it the way she had initially thought she would. She did not want to hold it at a careful distance and examine it. She wanted to let it be what it was. Thomas, for his part, had resolved the question much earlier and much more simply, in the way of children who are not yet burdened with strategy. He had decided that Daniel Vaughn was good, and that was the full extent of his analysis. In February, Daniel invited her and Thomas to the Vaughn ranch. She had not been there yet, and the invitation was significant in the way he made it, which was directly, and with the admission that he wanted her to see his home, not because he needed her approval of it, but because he wanted to share it with her. It was a longer ride than she had expected, 9 miles through the winter country along the East Ridge Road, with Thomas on the paint mare Daisy beside her and Daniel on the roan ahead. And as they came up the last rise before the ranch, the land opened wide and she saw the East Ridge properly for the first time, and understood something about Daniel Vaughn that she had not previously understood. The ridge ran long and slow to the south, pale grass and cedar, and the long dark line of a good creek that still ran clear even in February. The ranch house was stone and timber, not large but solid, built with the intention of lasting, and behind it the barn was in excellent repair, and the corrals were well maintained, and the 260 head, reduced by winter sales to roughly 200, moved steady and well-conditioned across the winter range. A man who kept his animals in that condition in February in this climate was a man who worked every day and took no shortcuts, and she looked at the Vaughn ranch and felt a profound respect that was entirely distinct from, though adjacent to, what she already felt. One of the ranch hands, a weathered man of perhaps 50 named Elias, came to take their horses, and Daniel introduced her as Mrs. Chandler, his neighbor and his friend, and Elias shook her hand with the grave courtesy of a man who was paying attention to what his employer said, and said he was glad to meet her, and she believed him. The house was clean in the way a man's house was clean when the man was particular about it rather than waiting for someone else to take care of it, which she noted. There were books on a shelf by the fireplace, and a good table in the kitchen and a cooking range that was better than hers, and a large window in the main room that looked out over the ridge to the south. She stood at that window for a long moment while Daniel built up the fire, and Thomas ran the length of the house with the energy of a boy who had been on horseback for an hour. And she looked out at the ridge and thought about space, and about belonging, and about the particular piece of land that was cared for. He made coffee and they sat at the table and talked, and it was exactly like every Sunday at her table except that it was his table and it felt, she realized, entirely natural. After they had eaten the lunch he had prepared, which was better than she expected and which she said so, and after Thomas had been taken by Elias to see the new colt that had arrived early from one of the mares, which Thomas regarded as the finest gift he had ever received, Daniel sat across from her at the table and said, in his careful, precise way, I'd like to talk about the spring arrangement you mentioned in your first letter. She set down her coffee cup. All right. I've been thinking, he said, about what a fair long-term arrangement looks like. Not just the winter, but going forward. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. I want to say something that is maybe both a business proposal and something else, and I want you to tell me if I'm reading the situation wrong. Go ahead, she said. He took a breath. I think we could combine the operations, yours and mine. Not in a way that swallows yours into mine, but in a genuine partnership where you know exactly what you own and what you're owed and have a full say in how things are run. He paused. And I think if you were willing that this would work a great deal better if we made it formal, as in marriage. She was quiet. He let the silence be. Daniel, she said. You can tell me it's too soon, he said, and there was, beneath the steadiness, a thread of something that was not quite vulnerability but was close to it, close enough to be real. And I'll understand that. I'm not asking you to answer today. I'm asking you to consider it. I have been considering it, she said honestly. I've been considering it since before I probably should have been. His eyes were on hers. And she looked at him across the table, this man who had written back when no one else wrote back with anything worth having, who had kept every word he had given her, who had seen her land and her son in her and dealt with all three of them honestly. And she thought about what she had said on the Dobbins porch, that she needed someone who would deal with her honestly. And she thought that this was that and that she had known it for some time. I'm not a woman who needs rescuing, she said. I know that, he said. I'm not entering into anything that makes me less than an equal partner. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. I wrote to you as a partner from the beginning. That hasn't changed and it won't, she breathed out slowly. Then yes, she said, I'll marry you. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and the gesture was so straightforward and so gentle and so entirely like him that she felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Thank you, he said, quietly and with great sincerity. For saying yes, she said. For the letters, he said. For being the kind of woman who wrote them. She laughed, a real laugh, bright and sudden, and he smiled his slow, good smile. And outside the window the winter range stretched wide and pale, and the sky above the ridge was as blue as the first day she had ever seen it. They told Thomas that evening on the ride home. Jane had thought about how to say it, but Thomas, who was 6 and perceptive in ways that were sometimes startling, had apparently already reached his own conclusions, because when she said that she and Mr. Vaughn were planning to get married, he looked from her to Daniel and back with an expression of profound satisfaction and said, I knew that. Did you? Daniel said. You come over all the time, Thomas said, as if this settled the matter completely. Then after a moment, will we live at your ranch or our ranch? We'll talk about that, Jane said. I think we should stay at our ranch, Thomas said, but you should come live there. You could bring Daisy's foal when it's born. Daniel looked at Jane over the boy's head and she looked back at him, and they did not say anything, but the look said several things that words would only have made smaller. The spring came early that year, or early enough. By March the creek was running again, and the grass was coming back green on the range, and the cattle were moving well, and the world smelled like thaw and mud and green things starting over. Jane's 12 head had wintered better than she had hoped, and with the arrangement with Daniel she had maintained their condition and kept them all through. She stood at the fence on a March morning and counted them, and felt a satisfaction that was clean and complete. The wedding was set for April. Not a large wedding, because neither of them wanted large, but a real one at the Methodist Church in McKinney, with the people they actually knew and cared for. Mrs. Whitmore, who had become a genuine friend over the winter, helped Jane with the dress, which was not the navy wool but a dove-gray silk she had found in a trunk, which had been her mother's, and which they altered together over 2 evenings at the kitchen table with pins and careful hands. Elias, who turned out to be something like a close friend to Daniel, came with his wife to the wedding and sat in the front row with the expression of a man who was very pleased with how things had turned out. Thomas sat beside them and wore his best shirt, and informed anyone who came near him that he would be getting a roan colt's cousin as a wedding present, which was not entirely accurate, but which Daniel had told him something adjacent to, and which Thomas had processed in his characteristic way. The ceremony was plain and straightforward and entirely sincere. The minister was a good man who did not make it longer than it needed to be. Daniel said his vows in the clear, measured tone of a man who was choosing every word because every word was true, and Jane said hers in the same spirit, looking at him with the full, open attention she had brought to everything since the morning she had decided that sentiment alone was not enough, but that sentiment combined with honesty and work and real partnership was perhaps more than enough. He put the ring on her hand, and it was a simple band, gold, which he had ridden to Dallas for, which she had not known and which she learned later, and she looked at it on her hand and then up at him, and the expression on his face was not complicated at all. It was happy. Simply and completely happy. They came home to her farm, which had been the plan, because the stone house was fine, but the Chandler land had the better water and Thomas knew every corner of it, and there was no good reason to uproot a 6-year-old when the man had just married his mother. Daniel had argued this case to himself long before anyone presented it to him, which she discovered when she raised the question, and he said he had already decided, if she was agreeable, that her land was the better base for the combined operation, and that Elias could manage the East Ridge stock day to day, which he did well anyway. They merged the operations in May, which was a great deal of paperwork that Jane did most of, at the kitchen table with the lamp going, her handwriting steady and clear on the ledger pages, while Daniel sat across from her going through the inventory lists. It was deeply unromantic and entirely satisfying. She was good at numbers, and he knew it and let her be good at them. And when she found an error in the spring tally, he looked at where she pointed and said, "You're right," without any qualification, which was so unremarkable and so fundamentally correct that she almost laughed. The combined herd by that summer was 140 head on the Chandler Range and 180 on the East Ridge, managed together under the Vaughn Chandler brand that Daniel filed at the county seat in July, which was her name's second, and she had not asked for it, but it was there. Thomas, who had turned 7 in June, and who had grown 2 inches over the winter in the way of boys who ate well and ran everywhere, had appointed himself a full working member of the ranch operation in the manner of a child who is completely serious about it. He could ride Daisy well and competently, and he had learned from Daniel, who taught with patience and specificity, the basics of reading stock condition and checking fence lines, and the names of the different grasses on the range. Daniel taught him all of this with the same steady attention he brought to everything, and Jane would watch them sometimes from the porch, the boy and the man moving along the fence line in the morning light, Thomas's hat falling over his eyes as always, Daniel reaching down without stopping to write it, and she would feel something so warm and complete that she had to look away for a moment before it overwhelmed her. She was in love, fully and without reservation. She had been in love before with Robert, and it had been real and good, but this was different in a way that she thought about sometimes. With Robert, love had been the thing that made the hard life bearable. With Daniel, love was the thing that made a life that was already bearable feel like abundance. She told him this one evening in August, sitting on the porch after supper while Thomas was inside with his school reader, and the last of the day's heat was going out of the air and the first stars were showing, and she said it plainly because she had learned that he received plain things best. He was quiet for a moment after she said it, looking at the darkening range. Then he said, "That's the finest thing anyone has ever said to me," in a voice that was quiet and a little rough, and he took her hand and held it on the arm of the porch chair, and they sat there while the stars came out one by one above the Texas land, and the cattle moved quiet on the range and the lamp burned in the window behind them. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The day I got your letter," he said, I had just come back from riding the East Ridge fence alone and thinking about the fact that I was going to be 33 years old, and I had 260 cattle and good land, and not a single person I had to come home to. He paused. I read your letter 3 times, not twice like I said, and the thing that I kept thinking was not about the business of it, though the business of it was sound. What I kept thinking was that here was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and was prepared to demonstrate it rather than apologize for it. He looked at her in the dark. I rode to your house that first Thursday wanting to meet you more than I had wanted anything in a long time. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight from the window, his face was clear and open and fully present in the way it always was with her. You hid that well, she said. I wasn't hiding it, he said. I was being careful with it. I didn't want to make you feel managed. She brought his hand up and pressed it once firmly, and then held it back on the chair arm. You have never once made me feel managed, she said. Good, he said with deep sincerity. That was always the intention. September came with its particular slant of golden light and its sharp mornings that smelled like change, and the fall work was good work, the kind that used every muscle and left a person tired in the satisfying way. Jane rode the range with Daniel most mornings, and managed the books and the domestic work and the raising of Thomas with an ease that came from having exactly enough help and being in exactly the right place. And she thought sometimes with a kind of quiet wonder about the woman who had sat at the kitchen table in October of the previous year, with the lamp burning low and 17 letters in front of her, and a long, hard winter ahead. That woman had known what she was worth. She was glad that one man had known it too. October arrived, and with it a new quiet in the evenings that Jane recognized with a private and growing wonder, a tiredness in the afternoons and a different quality to her mornings. And by the end of October, she sat with Daniel at the kitchen table and told him what she had come to understand, which was that there would be another child in the spring. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with an expression that was unmistakably a man receiving the best possible news he has ever received in his life, and he said nothing for long enough that she laughed. Daniel. Give me a moment, he said in a slightly unsteady voice. She gave him the moment. Thomas was at school and the kitchen was quiet and the October light came through the window and lay gold on the table between them. Are you well? He asked finally, still holding both her hands. Entirely, she said. Good, he said. That's the first thing, he exhaled. The second thing is that I am, he stopped, started again. Jane, I don't have a large word for this. I don't need a large word, she said. I am very, very happy, he said, simply and with the precision she loved him for. She felt her own happiness clearly and warmly, like the lamp turned up. So am I, she said. Thomas, informed at supper, processed the news with the characteristic thoroughness of a 7-year-old, who was also practical in his mother's image. He asked whether it would be a boy or a girl, and was told that no one could know yet, and he considered this, and said that he thought it should be a boy because boys were better at ranching, and Jane said that she would like him to reconsider that position, and Daniel said that his best ranch hand after Elia's was a woman named Helen who could rope better than any man he'd ever employed. And Thomas looked thoughtful and revised his position to say that either would be fine as long as they liked horses. This was accepted as a reasonable amendment. The winter of 1879 was gentler than the previous one, as if the land was being fair about it, compensating for what it had taken the year before. The cattle came through well and the range held, and the creek ran through December this time, which was not guaranteed and was gratefully received. Jane's pregnancy progressed with the solid good health of a woman in her prime doing work she was built for, and though Daniel watched her with a careful and attentive eye that she found both touching and occasionally excessive, she was very well and told him so frequently. He had an instinct to shelter her that she appreciated in concept and redirected in practice, because she was not a woman who could be folded away behind protective impulses, and he knew this about her, and when she reminded him, adjusted readily. What she did let him do was take on more of the writing work through December and January, the early morning fence checks and the longer range rides, which was not because she could not do them, but because the January mornings were genuinely cold, and the bed was warm and Daniel Vaughn was in it. And she found that she was perfectly content to let him go out in the cold while she stayed warm and managed the books by the kitchen stove. He came in from those mornings smelling like cold air and horse and the outdoors, and he would come to the kitchen, and she would hand him coffee without looking up from the ledger, and he would drink it leaning against the counter watching her work. And these were among the best mornings she had ever had. Thomas, who was growing with alarming speed and who had become deeply proficient at morning chores in the way of a child who wanted to be taken seriously, went out with Daniel most mornings, bundled in his winter coat with the hat that still fell over his eyes, and came back talking at length about things he had observed. He had his mother's eye for detail and his father's thoroughness, and Daniel had told Jane privately that the boy understood cattle in a way that was instinctive, and that he was already one of the more useful ranch hands on the property, which Jane had accepted with the precise pride of a woman who was trying not to be too obvious about how proud she was. The spring came, and with it everything that springs bring in Texas: the green rush of the range, the calving season, the planting, the return of warmth, and the arrival, on a warm morning in late April, of their son. He was born at home, as most children were, attended by the doctor from McKinney, who had ridden out the evening before when it was clear things were progressing, and who was a good, practical man who did his job well and did not make a fuss. Jane's labor was not easy, but it was not complicated either, and she bore it with the direct, focused concentration she brought to every difficult thing. And Daniel was outside in the yard for most of it, which was where he had been told to be, wearing a groove in the ground with his boots. When the doctor came to the door and told him he had a son, Daniel stood entirely still for a long moment and then said, "And Jane, is she, Mrs.?" "Vaughn is excellent," the doctor said, "strong as they come." He went in then and sat on the edge of the bed, and Jane put the baby in his arms, a small, red-faced, furious bundle who had already demonstrated his displeasure at the world with considerable volume, and Daniel held him with the careful, attentive hold of a man who was absolutely paying attention, and looked down at him with an expression that made Jane's chest ache with the fullness of it. "Hello," Daniel said to the baby, quietly. "I've been wanting to meet you." Thomas appeared in the doorway, having been kept in the front room with Elias' wife during the whole proceeding, and looked at the baby with wide eyes. "Is that him?" "That's him," Jane said from the pillow. Thomas came in and stood beside Daniel and looked at the baby with deep seriousness. "He's very small," he observed. "He'll get bigger," Daniel said. Thomas seemed to accept this. He looked at Jane. "Are you all right, Mama?" "I'm very all right," she said, and meant it. "What's his name?" Thomas asked. Jane looked at Daniel. They had talked about names in the abstract, but not with any resolution. "Robert," Daniel said, quietly looking at her. "If that suits you." She felt the fullness in her chest again, warm and clear. Robert had been a good man, and he had made this land, and he had made Thomas, and he deserved to have his name go forward. She had thought about this more than she had told Daniel, and he had arrived at the same place she had through his own consideration, which was exactly like him. "Robert," she said. "Yes, Robert Daniel Vaughn." Daniel looked at her with an expression she recognized now as his version of overwhelmed, which was quiet and still and very direct, and he said, "Thank you." "Stop thanking me for things," she said. "I'll stop when I stop having things to be grateful for," he said. "Which doesn't appear to be any time soon." Thomas leaned over the baby with great care and looked at him eye to eye. "Robert," he said, with the gravity of a boy formally acquainting himself, "I'm your brother. I'll teach you everything." Daniel caught Jane's eye over Thomas's head, and the look they shared was the look of two people who were sharing a moment of such joy that it circled around to something almost too large to hold. She held it anyway. She had always been good at holding large things. The summer of 1880 was the finest summer Jane could remember in a decade of Texas summers, which she knew was partly actual weather and partly the particular quality that good seasons have when a person is genuinely happy for the first time in a long time. The range was green into August, which was unusual and very welcome, and the combined herd had grown to just over 350 head with the spring calves, and the Vaughn Chandler operation was running in the clean, efficient way of something that has been built right. She kept the books and managed the supply ordering and rode the range 4 mornings a week and raised Thomas and young Robert and was good at all of it. Daniel worked the land with the same steady thoroughness that had produced the well-maintained operation she had seen on her first visit to the East Ridge Ranch, and Elias managed that range with the confidence of a man who had been given genuine trust and earned it. They had hired 2 additional hands for the season, a young man named Will who was 19 and learning fast, and a quieter older man named Frank who had been ranching since before the war and who knew things about cattle that no one else did. Thomas turned 8 that June and asked for and received a rope of his own and spent most of the summer practicing with it against a fence post with a patience that he had gotten entirely from his mother. He was going to be good at it. He was going to be good at most things, she thought. He had too many examples of competent people to not pick up the general principle. In August, on a long summer evening when Robert was asleep in the cradle, and Thomas was at the Whitmore place for a few days visiting the Whitmore boys, and the ranch was quiet in the way it only was when the children were elsewhere, Jane sat on the porch in the last of the day's heat, and Daniel came and sat beside her, and they had the kind of long evening conversation that had been the whole architecture of their courtship, and which had not diminished in marriage but grown in depth. Ranging over the ranch and the county and the coming fall work, and a book she had read and a letter he had received from his brother Sam in New Mexico, who was apparently doing well and had taken a wife of his own, which pleased Daniel genuinely. She leaned her head against his shoulder at some point in the evening, which was a thing she did sometimes that she knew he liked, and he put his arm around her in the easy, secure way he had, and they sat looking out at the range in the last light, the cattle dark shapes in the golden grass, the ridge long and pale to the east, the sky going every color it had before it gave up on the day. "Do you remember," she said, "what you wrote in your letter? That you didn't know me yet, but you knew the tone of my letter, and you thought I was someone who needed to be dealt with honestly and not managed." "I remember," he said. "I read that line 4 times before I wrote back," she said. "That was the line that made me willing to meet you." He was quiet a moment. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, a gentle, natural gesture that had become one of the rhythms of their life together, and she felt it with the simple pleasure of something that is precisely right. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "That morning I sent the letters," she said. "I burned Robert's old boots in the yard, because I had decided I couldn't afford sentiment anymore." She looked out at the range. "I was wrong about that, not about the boots. The boots were fine to burn, but I was wrong that sentiment and practicality were opposing things. I thought if I was going to survive I had to choose one or the other." She paused. "You managed to be both at once from the first letter you wrote me. That's not a common thing." "It's not complicated," he said. "You were worth being both things for." She lifted her head and looked at him, and he was looking at her with that steady, clear attention that had been the first thing she noticed about him and which had never changed. "I love you," she said, plainly and without any performance of it, the way she said everything that mattered. "I love you," he said back, in exactly the same register, and it was exactly right. The ranch continued, and the seasons turned, and the years laid themselves down one after the other with the particular richness of years that are full of work and love, and the steady presence of people who choose each other repeatedly and without question. Robert learned to walk, and then to run, and then, at 2.5, to climb things that he was not supposed to climb, which occupied a great deal of everyone's attention. Thomas at 9 was a serious, capable boy who rode his own fence line on Daisy every Saturday morning, and who had, by the end of that summer, developed a rope technique that made Frank the older hand nod once in quiet approval, which was the equivalent of considerable praise from Frank. The railroad came through Collin County in 1881, as it had been threatening to do for years, and it changed things, as railroads did, bringing more people and more commerce and more opportunity and also more complication. The cattle market opened wider with the rail access, and the Vaughn Chandler operation was well placed to take advantage of it, because Jane had seen it coming and had spent the previous fall increasing the herd strategically in preparation. Daniel had read her plan and said, simply, that it was good thinking, and proceeded to help her execute it, which was a pattern that had served them very well. There were difficulties, because there were always difficulties, and a drought in the late summer of 1881 that took the creek down to nothing for 6 weeks, and required moving stock and creative management of water sources, and a hard negotiation with a buyer out of Dallas who tried to compress the price on the spring sale, which Jane handled herself at the kitchen table with the ledger open and her pen in her hand and her voice entirely level. And the buyer came away with a fair price rather than a favorable one, which was all she had ever asked for anything. Holt Greer's operation ran into trouble that year, as operations built on short dealing eventually tended to do, and he sold off a significant portion of his land at less than it was worth, which Jane noted without satisfaction, because she had no use for satisfaction at another person's misfortune, but with the clear understanding that reputation built on honesty lasted, and reputation built on leverage did not. Thomas, at 10, wrote a letter to his Uncle Sam in New Mexico, which he composed at the kitchen table with his tongue between his teeth and which ran to 3 pages, and described the ranch operation in what Jane could only describe as thorough detail. Sam wrote back with equal enthusiasm and said that his own operation in New Mexico was coming along well and that he hoped to visit in the spring. And Daniel read this at supper with a pleasure that was deep and genuine, because he missed his brother and had been carrying that quietly for a long time. Sam did come in the spring, which was the spring of 1882, arriving with his wife, a dark-haired, direct woman from Santa Fe named Lucia, who Jane liked immediately and with certainty. And the house was full for 2 weeks in a way that it had not been before, noisy and warm and busy. And Robert, at nearly 2, regarded his Uncle Sam with the frank wonder of a child meeting an adult version of someone he already knew. Because Sam looked enough like Daniel that Robert kept looking from one to the other as if checking his work. The 2 brothers sat on the porch in the evenings after supper and talked in the way of people who had a great deal of catching up and no awkwardness about it, because they were fundamentally alike in the quality of their honesty, and Jane sat with Lucia at the kitchen table on those evenings, and they talked with the easy frankness of 2 women who recognized each other as the same kind of person. "Daniel was different before you," Lucia said one evening without any particular preamble. "Sam said so?" Jane asked. "Sam said he had not seen his brother this happy in his whole life," Lucia said, "and Sam is not a man who says things he doesn't mean." "No," Jane said. "That seems to be a family trait," Lucia smiled. "It is. It makes them easy to trust and occasionally difficult to argue with." Jane laughed, the sudden bright laugh that Daniel had always liked in her. "Yes," she said, "that's exact." The summer passed well, and Sam and Lucia went back to New Mexico with promises of correspondence that were kept, and the fall came and the work came with it, and Jane stood one morning in October, which was the October of 1882, exactly 4 years from the morning she had written 17 letters at the kitchen table, and she stood at the fence in the morning light and looked at the range, which was hers and Daniel's both, and counted what she could see. The cattle moving easy on the autumn grass, Thomas across the yard working Daisy on a long line with the competence of a boy who had grown up to the work, Robert toddling between the porch rails and shouting his brother's name, Daniel coming. across the yard from the barn with the particular steady gait that she knew from a long way off and which she had come to associate with the simple, reliable fact of him. He reached the fence and leaned on it beside her and followed her gaze across the range. And they stood there together in the October morning, light in the exact way they had stood on various porches and fences and range lines over the years, comfortable in the proximity of each other the way people are when they have chosen well and know it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She thought about the question honestly. "I'm thinking," she said, "about how much can change in 4 years if a person decides to ask for what's fair and someone decides to give it." He considered this. "That's good thinking," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said, which was not entirely accurate since she had been doing it before he arrived, and he knew this and would say so. "You were doing that long before you met me," he said, exactly on schedule. "I know," she said, "but it's easier with someone who understands the principle." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him a little, looking at the range, at Thomas and Robert and the cattle and the good land, at the creek which was running well this fall, at the pale sky above the east ridge where the morning sun was still climbing. "Jane," he said. "Daniel," she said, "I'm glad you only got one letter worth answering." She thought about the 17 letters and the 15 responses that had been less than fair and the one that had not been, which she still had, folded in the bottom of her writing box, the handwriting plain and even and deliberate, the way he was and had always been. "So am I," she said, "more than I know how to say." "You don't have to say it," he said. "I know." She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the morning light was on his face and everything was exactly what it was, which was good and true and hers. Robert shouted something from the porch and Thomas shouted back, and the cattle moved steady in the morning light, and the creek ran silver behind the property, and the red Texas earth held up everything that had been built on it. 4 years of work and partnership and love so solid and real that it had no need of large words, only the daily practice of it, which was the best and most lasting kind. She had sent 17 letters asking for fair trade, and only one man had written back and meant it. And she had built a life on that single honest letter the way you build a house on good ground, stone by stone, day by day, year by year, until it was the kind of life that held against every winter and every drought and every hard season, because it had been made right from the start, and what is made right does not come undone. The morning was still coming in over the ridge, gold and wide and entirely generous, and Jane Chandler Vaughn stood at her fence with her husband's arm around her, and her sons in the yard before her and her cattle on the autumn range, and felt, with the full, clear, unhurried certainty of a woman who had learned to ask for what she deserved, and to recognize it when it came, that this was abundance. This was the real thing. This was what fair trade looked like when both parties brought everything they had and kept every word they gave, and she would not have traded it, not a single letter of it, for anything the wide world had to offer.